They poured the water into the dust right in front of him, slow enough for every man on that porch to watch it disappear. Ethan Cole didn't move at first, not when the last drop darkened the dry ground, not when the laughter followed like something rehearsed, not even when the wind carried that faint, cruel smell of wet dirt back up to his cracked lips. He just stood there, boots planted in the powdery street, shoulders heavy with miles, eyes fixed on the place where water had been offered to the earth, but not to a man who needed it. 2 days without a drink had a way of stripping a person down to something honest. And there was nothing left in him now but that honesty and the quiet understanding that this wasn't about thirst anymore. It was about being seen and measured and found unworthy by people who had already decided who he was the moment he rode in from the west. The town sat under a hard morning sun, wooden buildings bleached and tired, a place that had learned to survive by closing its doors before it ever opened its heart. And the men on that porch leaned back in their chairs like judges without robes, their hats tilted just enough to shade their eyes but not enough to hide what sat behind them. One of them nudged the empty bucket with his boot, letting it tip over with a hollow sound that echoed farther than it should have. And somewhere behind Ethan, a horse shifted its weight, leather creaking, the only thing in town that didn't seem interested in the outcome. "You heard him," someone said, voice lazy. Like this was nothing more than a passing moment, like denying water was the same as refusing a seat at a card table, and Ethan finally blinked, slow, deliberate, as if pulling himself back from somewhere far away, his hand drifting to the canteen hanging at his side, fingers brushing the dented metal that had been empty since yesterday afternoon. He lifted it slightly, not to drink, just to feel its weight, or lack of it, then let it fall back against his hip with a soft, final tap that seemed louder than the laughter that followed. No one offered anything else, no second thought, no hesitation, not even the sheriff standing in the doorway of the saloon. A man named Harold Pike who had built his reputation on keeping order, but now stood perfectly still, eyes sliding away at the exact moment they should have held steady. Ethan noticed that, filed it somewhere quiet, the way a man remembers small things that later turn out not to be small at all. A boy stood near the hitching post, no older than 10, watching everything with wide eyes that hadn't learned yet when to look away. And when one of the men flicked a glance toward him, the boy straightened, as if taking instruction without a word being spoken, as if this moment was a lesson he would carry longer than anyone else here. Ethan shifted his weight, the dust crunching under his boots, and for a second it looked like he might say something, might argue, might ask again. But whatever thought rose in him faded just as quickly, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, the kind of decision that doesn't need to be announced. He reached up, adjusted the brim of his hat against the glare, and turned slightly, not in defeat but in acknowledgement, like a man accepting the truth of a place rather than fighting it. His gaze passed over the faces one by one, not lingering, not accusing, just seeing. And there was something in that look that made the laughter thin out at the edges, though no one could have said exactly why. Then he stepped off the boardwalk, boots hitting the street with a dull, grounded sound, and began to walk, not fast, not slow, just steady, the kind of pace that suggested he knew exactly where he was going even if no one else did. Behind him, the town resumed its noise and pieces, a chair scraping, a door swinging, a voice picking up where it had left off. But it didn't quite fit together the same way it had before, as if something small had shifted beneath it all. Ethan didn't look back, not when the sun climbed higher, not when the heat began to press down harder, not even when the wind changed direction and carried the faint scent of water from somewhere beyond the hills. He walked past the last building, past the edge of what they called civilization, and out into the open land where the horizon stretched wide and unforgiving, and only then did. He stopped for a moment, resting his hand on the neck of his horse, feeling the slow, steady breath beneath his palm. Somewhere far off, beyond the ridgeline, unseen and unheard by the town behind him, another pair of eyes had been watching from the shade of stone and scrub, eyes that had witnessed every second of what had just happened without interruption, without judgment, but not without memory. Ethan exhaled, long and quiet, then reached down and unclipped the empty canteen, holding it in his hand for a brief second before setting it gently on the ground beside the trail, not thrown, not discarded, just placed, like something that had served its purpose and would now serve another. He straightened, adjusted his saddle, and mounted up in one smooth motion, the leather settling under him with a familiar creak, and with one last glance at the endless stretch ahead, he nudged his horse forward, leaving behind a town that believed the moment had already passed, unaware that by dawn, silence itself would come riding back for them. The road stretched out ahead in long, pale ribbons of dust, the kind that clung to boots and memory alike. And Ethan Cole rode without looking back, not because he had forgotten what happened in that town, but because he had already decided it was something that would not be answered with words. The sun climbed slow and heavy, pressing heat into the land until even the air felt tired, and his horse moved with that steady patience only animals seem to understand, conserving strength, trusting. The rider without needing explanation. Somewhere to the east, a hawk circled high, its shadow passing over rock and scrub in quiet arcs, and Ethan tracked it for a moment, not because it mattered, but because it was easier than thinking about the dryness in his throat or the hollow weight at his side where the canteen used to hang. Hours passed like that, measured in hoofbeats and silence, until the land began to change in small ways, the kind you only noticed if you had spent enough time out here to understand that nothing ever truly stayed the same. The ground dipped slightly, the wind shifted direction, and with it came a scent that did not belong to dust or heat. Something cooler, something alive, and Ethan slowed his horse without realizing it, his body reacting before his thoughts caught up. He followed that scent off the main trail, guiding the animal down a narrow path that wound between low ridges and scattered stones, the kind of place most men would pass by without noticing, and that was exactly why it remained untouched. When he finally saw the water, it was not much, just a thin stream slipping through the earth like it was trying not to be found. But it was enough, more than enough for a man who had gone too long without it. Ethan dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with less certainty than before, and for a second he just stood there, looking at the water as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Then he knelt, cupping his hands, letting the coolness settle into his skin before bringing it to his lips, and the first sip was not relief, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that reminded him he was still here, still standing, still able to choose what kind of man he was going to be after. Everything that had happened. He drank again, slower this time, more deliberate, then leaned back on his heels, eyes closing briefly as the tension in his shoulders eased just enough to let him breathe properly for the first time in 2 days. His horse stepped closer, lowering its head to drink as well, the sound of water against the stones soft and steady, and for a moment, the world felt balanced again, like it had corrected something small but important. That was when he felt it, not a sound, not a movement, just the awareness that he was no longer alone. Ethan did not reach for anything, did not turn sharply. He simply opened his eyes and looked toward the ridge above the stream. And there she was, standing still enough to blend into the land itself, a woman with dark hair pulled back, her posture straight, her presence quiet but unmistakable. Nayeli had been there longer than he had. That much was clear, her gaze steady, not curious, not hostile, just watching in a way that suggested she had already seen everything she needed to see. Neither of them spoke at first, the silence between them not empty but full, like a space where words would only make things smaller than they really were. Ethan shifted slightly, resting one hand on his knee, acknowledging her presence without challenge, and after a moment, she stepped down from the ridge, her movement smooth, deliberate, each step placed with the kind of care that came from knowing the land did not forgive carelessness. When she reached the edge of the stream, she did not cross it, did not come closer than necessary. She simply stood there, the distance between them measured and intentional. Her eyes moved briefly to the place on his belt where a canteen should have been, then back to his face. And something in that glance held understanding, not of his story, but of what it meant to go without, to be denied something simple and essential. Ethan followed her gaze for a second, then looked away, not out of shame, but because there was nothing to explain that she had not already understood. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest trace of dust from the direction of the town he had left behind, and Nayeli turned her head slightly toward it, as if listening to something far beyond what could be heard. Her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened. When she looked back at him, there was a decision in her eyes, quiet and firm, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud. She knelt by the stream, filling a small leather container with water, her movements precise, unhurried, then set it carefully on a flat stone between them, not offering it directly, not closing the distance, just placing it where it could be. Taken without obligation, Ethan watched her do it, the gesture simple, almost unremarkable, and yet it carried more weight than anything that had happened in that town, because this time, the water was not given to the ground, and it was not withheld from a man who needed it. It was simply there, waiting, and when he reached for it, their eyes met for a brief second, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as two people who understood that some things did not need to be spoken to be remembered. And far behind them, beyond the hills and the heat and the distance, the town continued its day unaware that something had already begun to move toward it, slow and certain, like a change in the wind that no one notices until it is too late to pretend it is nothing at all. The water sat between them for only a moment before Ethan lifted it, not with urgency but with care, as if the weight of it deserved more respect than his thirst had been given earlier that morning. And when he drank, he did not empty it. He stopped halfway, lowering the container and setting it back on the stone in the same place where she had left it, a quiet acknowledgement that some things were not meant to be taken all at once. Naeli watched that, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition, the kind that came from noticing small decisions that revealed more than words ever could. And for a while neither of them moved, the stream continuing its soft path through the earth, the only sound that seemed certain of its purpose. The sun had begun to lean west, its light stretching longer across the ground, turning everything into sharper contrast, and Ethan finally rose, brushing dust from his knees, his body steadier now, his breath even, but his mind still, carrying the shape of what had been done to him and what he had chosen not to do in return. Naeli stepped forward then, not crossing fully into his space, but close enough that the distance no longer felt like a boundary, and she spoke for the first time, her voice low, measured, shaped by a language that carried weight even when translated into simple English. "You left your canteen behind," and Ethan gave a slight nod, eyes drifting toward the horizon where the trail disappeared back toward the town. "It was empty," he said, his voice rough but calm, and she tilted her head slightly, as if considering something beyond the words themselves. "Empty things can still be carried," she replied, and there was no judgment in it, only observation, only truth laid gently on the ground between them. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a faint almost smile touching the edge of his expression, not because he found humor in it, but because he understood what she meant. "Sometimes you have to leave something behind to see what it was worth," he said, and for a brief second, something passed between them, not agreement, not disagreement, just a shared understanding that neither of them needed to explain further. The wind shifted again, stronger this time, carrying with it the distant echo of something that did not belong to this quiet place, a faint rhythm, too far to hear clearly, but present enough to be felt if you were listening the right way. And Naeli turned her head slightly, her posture changing in a way that was almost invisible unless you were watching for it, her shoulders tightening just enough to suggest attention, not alarm, and Ethan followed her gaze, though he could see nothing but heat rising off the distant land. "They will not understand," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, and Ethan did not ask who she meant, because he already knew. He had seen their faces, heard their laughter, felt the weight of their silence when it mattered most. Understanding was never offered in that town. It had to be earned, and even then, it was given reluctantly. "Maybe they do not need to," he replied, adjusting the strap of his saddle, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was measuring each second against something unseen. And Naeli studied him again, longer this time, her eyes searching not for weakness, but for intention, for the line that separated a man who endured from a man who acted. When she spoke again, her words came with quiet certainty. "They will remember," and there was something in the way she said it that carried more weight than a threat ever could, not because it promised harm, but because it promised consequence, the kind that settled deep and did not fade with time. Ethan met her gaze, holding it steady, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that shifted, not anger, not pride, but something closer to acceptance, as if he had already stepped onto a path that would not allow him to turn back even if he wanted to. And maybe that was the moment everything truly began, not with the denial of water, not with the quiet act of kindness at the stream, but with the understanding that what came next would not belong to him alone. Nayeli reached down then and lifted the container. Again, securing it to her side, her movements efficient, practiced, and when she straightened, she looked once more toward the distant town, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, the kind of look that did not belong to a single person, but to something larger, something that moved through people rather than stopping with them. Ethan mounted his horse again, the leather settling beneath him, the familiar weight grounding him in the present, and for a moment, he hesitated, not because he did not know where to go, but because he understood that whatever direction he chose would lead him back to the same place eventually. Some roads do not offer alternatives, only timing. Nayeli stepped back toward the ridge, her figure already beginning to blend with the land. Again, and just before she disappeared into that quiet distance, she spoke one last time, not looking at him, not needing to. Dawn comes quickly here, and then she was gone, leaving only the sound of the stream and the faint shift of wind across stone. Ethan sat there for a moment longer, letting the words settle, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel their meaning. Then he turned his horse, not toward the town, not yet, but along a path that would circle wide and bring him thereby. Morning, because some things were not meant to be rushed, and as the sun dipped lower and the land cooled by degrees, something unseen began to gather beyond the ridges, quiet and patient, moving not with urgency, but with purpose, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be felt long before it arrived. The sun slipped lower behind the ridges, dragging long shadows across the land like quiet warnings that the day had said all it was going to say, and Ethan rode along the outer edge of the valley without hurry, guiding his horse through narrow paths that curved away from the obvious routes, the kind of trails that only showed themselves if you were not looking directly at them. The air cooled by slow degrees, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant stone, and with every mile, the world grew. Quieter, not empty, but watchful, as if something unseen had begun to pay attention. Ethan did not push his horse, did not force the pace. He let the rhythm settle into something natural, something steady, because whatever was coming did not need speed, it needed timing. Behind him, far beyond the hills, the town moved into evening without knowing it had already been measured, lanterns flickering to life one by one, voices rising in familiar patterns, chairs scraping against wooden floors, the same routines repeated as if nothing had shifted beneath them, as if the ground itself had not taken note of what had been done that morning. Sheriff Harold Pike stood in the doorway of the saloon again, his posture the same as before, but his eyes less certain, drifting now toward the open road more often than they should have, as if something in him had not settled back into place, as if silence had followed Ethan out of town and left something behind in its absence. The boy by the hitching post lingered longer than usual, his gaze fixed on the dry patch of dirt where the water had been poured out, his small boots scuffing the ground, as if trying to understand what could not be undone by simple movement. And when his mother called him from across the street, he hesitated just a second too long before turning away. Out beyond all of that, beyond the reach of lantern light and familiar voices, the land shifted in ways too subtle for most to notice, small movements along the ridges, shadows that did not belong to rocks, patterns forming where there had been none before, not fast, not loud, but certain, like a thought that had already been decided before it was spoken. Ethan felt it before he saw anything, the same way a man feels a storm long before the sky changes, a quiet pressure in the air, a sense that the world had leaned slightly in one direction and was not going to lean back. He slowed his horse near a low rise, the kind that gave just enough height to see without being seen, and he dismounted, leading the animal the last few steps to the crest, his boots making almost no sound against the packed earth. From there, the valley opened wide beneath him, the town small in the distance, its lights beginning to glow like scattered embers, and for a moment, it looked peaceful, unchanged, like any other place settling into night. Ethan rested his hand on the saddle, his gaze steady, not searching, not expecting, just waiting, and then he saw them. Not all at once, not in a single movement, but in pieces, a figure on one ridge, another on the next, shapes emerging from the land itself as if they had always been there and were only now choosing to be noticed. They did not ride fast, did not call out, did not gather in any hurried way. They simply took their places, one by one, forming a presence rather than a line, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. Ethan did not count them, not because he could not, but because the number did not matter. What mattered was the stillness, the way they held their ground without shifting, without restlessness, as if the night itself had decided to stand watch. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely there, and for the first time since leaving the town, his shoulders settled into something that was not tension, not relief, but recognition, the kind that came when a path you had already chosen finally revealed where it was leading. He reached down, running his hand along the horse's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, grounding himself in something simple, something certain, while the world beyond that quiet moment continued to arrange itself. Without asking for his permission, below, the town carried on, unaware that it was no longer alone in the way it believed itself to be, unaware that every light, every voice, every movement had begun to exist inside a larger silence that was drawing closer with each passing minute. Ethan lifted his gaze once more, scanning the ridges not with curiosity, but with acceptance, and though no one spoke, though no signal was given, something passed through that silent gathering, a shared understanding that did not need words. And as the last light of day faded into the kind of darkness that held more than it revealed, Ethan stepped back from the rise, took the reins in hand, and began to move again, not toward the town directly, but along the edge of what was coming, because some moments were not meant to be entered, only witnessed, and far below, beneath the quiet weight of the night, the town stood exactly where it had always been, not knowing that by the time the first light touched its streets again, it would no longer feel like the same place it had been before. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, a thin line of pale light stretching across the horizon before anyone in the town had the chance to notice that something was already different. The air felt heavier, not with heat but with stillness, the kind that pressed gently against the skin and made even the smallest sound seem out of place. Sheriff Harold Pike was the first to step outside, his boots landing on the wooden porch with a hollow echo that carried farther than usual, and he paused there, one hand resting on the doorframe, his eyes scanning the street not for trouble, but for something he could not yet name. The town looked the same, buildings standing where they always had, dust settled in familiar patterns, horses tied where they had been left the night before, but there was a space beneath it all that felt altered, like a breath being held too long. A door creaked open across the street, then another, people stepping out into the early light, their movements slower, quieter, as if they too felt it without understanding why, and it did not take long before someone noticed the ridgeline. It started with a glance, a man shading his eyes against the rising sun, his posture shifting as his gaze fixed on something beyond the town, and then another followed, and another, until the quiet began to spread not through sound, but through the absence of it. They were there, not moving, not advancing, just present, figures standing along the high ground that surrounded the town on all sides, spaced with intention, each one still as stone, their silhouettes clear against the growing light. No one counted them at first, because the number did not matter. What mattered was the shape they formed, not a line, not a circle, but something that felt complete, something that left no space untouched. Sheriff Pike stepped down from the porch slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a softness that did not match the weight in his chest, and he moved a few paces into the street, his hand hovering near his belt out of habit rather than need, because there was nothing in front of him that called for force, only for understanding, and that was something he had never been trained to provide. The boy from the hitching post stood beside him now, his small frame rigid, his eyes wide but not with fear, with something closer to recognition, as if he had been expecting this in a way he could not explain. The town gathered in the street without being told, men and women stepping out of their routines, drawn by the same quiet pull, their voices absent, their usual confidence replaced by a hesitation that settled into their shoulders and held them there. No one shouted. No one reached for anything, because there was nothing to reach for that would make sense of what they were seeing. The figures on the ridges did not move, did not signal, did not speak, and yet their presence pressed inward, not as a threat, but as a question that could not be ignored. Time stretched in that way it does when something important is happening and no one knows how to respond. Seconds feeling longer than they should, breaths taken more carefully, as if the wrong movement might break something that had not yet revealed itself. Sheriff Pike swallowed, his gaze moving from one ridge to another, trying to find a pattern, a leader, a reason, but there was only stillness. Only the quiet certainty that whatever this was, it had already been decided long before he stepped outside. The man who had poured the water the day before shifted uncomfortably near the saloon, his eyes darting toward the ground, then back to the ridges, as if searching for a way to undo something that could not be undone. And for the first time since anyone could remember, no one laughed. No one filled the silence with easy noise, because the silence itself had become something that demanded to be heard. Far beyond the edge of the town, just out of sight but not out of reach, Ethan Cole sat mounted on his horse along a distant rise, his figure small against the land, his posture steady, his gaze fixed not on the people below, but on the space between them and the ridges, the place where understanding would either appear or fail to. He did not move, did not signal, did not claim what was unfolding, because this was not his to control, not his to direct. It was something that had grown from a single moment and now stood on its own, larger than any one man. The sun climbed higher, its light sharpening the outlines of everything it touched, revealing details that could no longer hide in shadow, and as it did, the weight of what had been done the day before settled over the town with a clarity that no words could have delivered. The ground where the water had been poured out lay dry and unchanged, but now it carried meaning, not because of what it held, but because of what it had refused to hold. And as the people stood there, facing the silent figures above them, that meaning began to take shape inside each of them in a different way, some with discomfort, some with realization, and some with a quiet, growing understanding that this moment was not asking for anything except that they see it clearly and remember it long after the figures on the ridges were gone. No one gave the order to move, and yet something shifted in the street as if the town itself had taken a breath it could no longer hold, a quiet ripple passing through the gathered people not as sound but as awareness, the kind that settles behind the eyes and makes a man look at things he had ignored before. Sheriff Harold Pike took one slow step forward, then another, not toward the ridges, but toward the center of the street where the dry patch of earth still marked the place where water had been poured out, his boots stopping just short of it, as if there was a line he could not cross without understanding why it was there. The morning light had grown stronger now, washing over the buildings and faces alike, leaving no shadows deep enough to hide behind, and in that clarity, the memory of the day before stood sharper than it had any right to, not as a story, but as a fact that refused to soften with time. The man who had tipped the bucket shifted again, his hands restless at his sides, his gaze dropping to the ground before lifting again toward the ridges. And there was something in his posture that had not been there yesterday, something smaller, something uncertain, as if the weight of what he had done had finally found a place to rest. The boy stepped forward then, just a single step, but it carried farther than anything else that had happened since the sun rose. His small boots crossing the edge of that dry patch, his eyes fixed not on the figures above, but on the ground below, and for a moment, no one stopped him, no one called his name, because they were all watching, waiting to see what he would do. He crouched down, brushing his fingers lightly over the dust, as if searching for something that was no longer there. Then he stood again, turning his head slowly toward the saloon where the bucket still lay on its side, forgotten in the corner of the porch. The movement was simple, almost nothing, and yet it drew every eye with it. A quiet line forming between where the water had been denied and where it had once been held. Sheriff Pike followed that line with his gaze, his jaw tightening just enough to show that something inside him had begun to shift, not in defiance, not in fear, but in recognition, the kind that comes too late to prevent what has already happened, but early enough to change what comes next. Above them, the figures on the ridges remained exactly as they had been, still and silent, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply present, as if they were not there to act, but to witness. and that presence carried a weight that no words could have matched. The wind moved lightly through the street, lifting small curls of dust that drifted across the ground and settled again without pattern, without purpose, and in that gentle motion, the stillness felt even heavier, as if the land itself was waiting. The man by the saloon finally moved, slow at first, then with a steadier pace, stepping toward the bucket as if it had become something more than just a container, something that held a choice rather than water. And when he reached it, he paused, his hand hovering above the handle, his eyes flicking once toward the ridges, then back down again. No one spoke, no one urged him on, because whatever he did next could not be given to him. It had to come from the same place that had chosen otherwise the day before. His fingers closed around the handle, lifting the bucket upright, the metal scraping softly against the wood, and for a moment, he simply held it there, as if testing the weight of it, as if trying to understand how something so simple could have carried so much. The boy watched him, unmoving now, his small frame steady in a way that did not belong to his years, and Sheriff Pike's gaze moved between them, seeing not just what was happening, but what it meant, how a single act had become a line drawn across the town, one side of it yesterday, the other side waiting to be chosen. Far beyond the street, Ethan Cole remained where he had been, his figure still against the rise, his eyes following the same quiet movements, not with expectation, not with demand, but with the understanding that this moment belonged to them, not to him, that whatever changed here would not be because he had forced it, but because they had seen it for themselves. The man with the bucket turned then, not toward the saloon, not toward the ridges, but toward the center of the street where the dry earth waited, and he took a step forward, then another, each one slower than the last, as if the ground itself had grown heavier beneath his feet. The silence deepened, not empty, but full, pressing gently against every face, every thought, every memory, until there was no space left to hide from it. And in that silence, the difference between what had been done and what could still be done stood clear, not as judgment, but as a choice that could no longer be ignored. The man with the bucket stopped just short of the dry patch, his boots pressing into the dust as if the ground itself was asking him to be certain, and for a long second he did nothing, his grip tightening around the handle, his breath shallow in a way he could not hide, not from the people behind him, and not from the silence that surrounded them all. The town watched, not with impatience, not with anger, but with something quieter, something that had not lived here before, a kind of waiting that carried weight instead of noise. Sheriff Harold Pike shifted his stance slightly, his eyes fixed on the man's back, not as a lawman ready to intervene, but as a witness who understood that whatever happened next would not be written in any rulebook he had ever followed. The boy stood still, his gaze steady, not blinking, not looking away, as if he had already chosen his side in a way the adults had not yet managed to do. Above them, the figures on the ridges remained unchanged, unmoving, silent, their presence pressing down not like a threat, but like a mirror held up to everything below. The wind brushed lightly across the street, lifting a thin veil of dust that drifted between boots and settled again without sound. And in that small motion, the moment seemed to stretch even further, as if time itself had slowed to make room for what needed to be done. The man finally moved, not quickly, not with confidence, but with a careful intention that showed in every step, and he knelt, lowering the bucket to the ground with a soft scrape that echoed louder than it should have, his hands steady now in a way they had not been before. He reached for the canteen lying near the edge of the street, the same dented metal that had been left behind the day before, and when his fingers closed around it, there was a pause, a brief hesitation that carried the weight of memory, of choice, of everything that had led to this single moment. He stood again, the canteen in one hand, the bucket in the other, and turned slightly, not toward the ridges, not toward the sheriff, but toward the boy, as if the direction itself mattered, as if the act needed to be seen through the eyes of someone who had not yet learned to look away. Then, without a word, he dipped the canteen into the bucket, the metal meeting water with a soft, hollow sound that seemed to travel through the silence like a signal, and when he lifted it, droplets ran down the sides, catching the morning light before falling back to the ground. But this time, they did not disappear unnoticed. He held it there for a second, just long enough for everyone to see, just long enough for the meaning to settle. And then he stepped forward, placing the filled canteen gently on the dry patch of earth where the water had once been denied. No one spoke, no one moved. But something shifted, something quiet and irreversible, like a line being crossed without anyone needing to announce it. The boy took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the canteen. And for a moment it seemed as though the entire town leaned with him, their attention narrowing to that single point, that simple object that now held more than water. It held a decision, a correction, a recognition that could not be undone. Sheriff Pike exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that he understood what had happened, not because it had been explained, but because it had been done. Above them, the figures on the ridges did not react, did not move, but there was something in the air that changed, something almost imperceptible, as if the silence itself had acknowledged what it had been waiting for. Far beyond the town, Ethan Cole watched from the rise, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, and when he saw the canteen placed on that patch of earth, he did not smile, did not nod. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if marking the end of something that had begun the day before. When he opened them again, the world looked the same, the town still small in the distance, the ridges still lined with silent figures, but the weight had shifted, not lifted, but settled into a different shape, one that did not press down as heavily as before. Back in the street, the man stepped away from the canteen, his hands empty now, his shoulders no longer carrying the same tension, and though no one said it aloud, the town understood, not all at once, not completely, but enough to know that something had been returned, not to a man, not to a moment, but to themselves. The sun climbed higher, its light spreading evenly across the ground, and as it did, the stillness that had held the town began to loosen, not breaking, but easing, like a breath finally released after being held too long. And above it all, the silent figures remained for just a while longer, long enough to be seen, long enough to be remembered, before the land slowly began to take them back, one by one, until only the ridges remained, and the town stood beneath them, quieter than before, but not empty, not unchanged, and certainly not unaware. The ridges emptied the way dawn fades from the sky, not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to and say it happened there. Only in the quiet realization that something which had been present was no longer standing where it had been, and yet the space it left behind did not feel empty. It felt marked, like a place that had been seen too clearly to ever return to what it was. Before, the town remained still for a long moment after the last figure blended back into the land, as if no one trusted the silence to hold without breaking, as if movement itself might undo what had just taken place. And Sheriff Harold Pike stood at the center of it, his gaze lingering on the ridgeline long after there was nothing left to see, his shoulders squared not with authority, but with the weight of understanding that had come too late to prevent anything, but early enough to change. What followed? The man who had filled the canteen stepped back toward the porch slowly, his boots dragging slightly through the dust, not out of exhaustion, but because something inside him had shifted and had not yet settled into its new shape. And when he reached the edge of the boards, he stopped, looking down at his hands as if expecting to find something different there, something that would explain why they no longer felt the same as they had the day before. The boy moved next, not with hesitation, but with a quiet certainty that did not belong to someone his age, stepping into the center of the street and bending to pick up the canteen, his small fingers wrapping around the dented metal as if it had always belonged in his hands. And when he stood, he did not look toward the ridges. He did not look toward the sheriff. He looked toward the road leading out of town, the same road where a man had walked away without asking twice. No one stopped him as he took a few slow steps in that direction, not because they did not notice, but because something in them understood that this was not a moment to interrupt, that whatever was happening now had already been earned by what had happened before. The wind shifted again, softer this time, carrying with it the scent of the land rather than the memory of dust, and the town seemed to breathe in unison, not loudly, not noticeably, but enough to feel the change in the air. Ethan Cole remained on the rise, his figure steady against the horizon, and when he saw the boy step forward with the canteen in hand, he did not move to meet him, did not call out, he simply watched, allowing the distance between them to hold its meaning. Because some gestures were not meant to be met halfway. They were meant to travel the full distance on their own. The boy stopped just at the edge of the town, where the packed dirt gave way to the open trail. And for a moment, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the awareness that this step was different from the others, that crossing this line meant carrying something beyond the place he had always known. And then he continued, his boots leaving faint impressions in the dust that would fade with time, but not with memory. Behind him, the town began to move again, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether the world would allow it. Doors opening, voices returning in softer tones, movements resuming with a care that had not existed before, and Sheriff Pike turned slightly, his eyes following the boy for a moment before drifting back to the street, to the place where the canteen had been set down, to the patch of earth that no longer felt empty, but filled with something that could not be seen. The man by the porch sat down heavily, not in defeat, but in reflection, his gaze unfocused as if he was looking inward rather than outward, and no one spoke to him. No one needed to, because whatever he was thinking was not something that could be shaped by another voice. Out on the trail, the boy approached slowly, his steps measured, his grip firm, and Ethan remained where he was, his horse still, his posture unchanged, waiting not with expectation, but with patience, the kind that did not rush what needed to arrive on its own. When the boy finally reached him, he did not speak. He simply held out the canteen, his arm steady, his eyes clear, and Ethan looked at it for a moment before taking it. Not quickly, not gratefully, but with the same quiet respect that had marked every choice he had made since leaving the town. Their eyes met briefly, not as strangers, not as something else, but as two people standing on either side of a moment that had already changed them both. And then the boy stepped back, turning without hesitation, walking the same path he had come without looking over his shoulder. Ethan secured the canteen at his side, his hand resting on it for a second longer than necessary, feeling its weight, feeling what it now carried beyond water. And then he turned his horse, not toward the town, not toward the ridges, but toward the open land that stretched ahead, because what had needed to happen had already found its place. And as he rode on, the distance between him and the town grew once more, but this time it did not feel like separation. It felt like something that had been set right, without a single word needing to be spoken. The trail stretched out in front of Ethan Cole like a promise that did not need to be spoken, wide and open, carrying him farther from the town with every steady step of his horse. And yet something of that place stayed with him, not as a burden, not as a wound, but as a quiet weight that had settled into its proper place. The canteen at his side moved gently with the rhythm of the ride, no longer empty, no longer forgotten. And every time it brushed against his leg, it reminded him not of thirst, but of choice, of how a single moment could travel farther than any man ever could. The land ahead rolled out in soft rises and long stretches of dry grass, the kind that whispered under the wind like it had its own stories to tell, stories that did not belong to towns or names, but to something older, something that did not change easily. Ethan did not look back, not because he refused to remember, but because he understood that some things were meant to remain where they happened, to take root there and grow into something that others would have to face in their own time. Behind him, the town had begun to move again, but not in the same way it had before, the sound softer, the movement slower, as if each person had become aware of the space they occupied and the weight of what they chose to do within it. Sheriff Harold Pike stood once more at the edge of the street, his gaze no longer drifting, no longer uncertain, but fixed on the place where the boy had walked out, following the line of footprints that were already beginning to fade in the dust. And though he said nothing, there was something in the way he held himself that suggested he would not forget what he had seen, that he would carry it forward in ways that could not yet be measured. The man who had filled the canteen remained seated on the porch, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes lowered not in shame, but in thought, the kind that does not resolve quickly, the kind that lingers and changes a man slowly over time. And no one disturbed him, because whatever he was working through belonged to him alone. The boy returned at last, stepping back into the town with the same quiet certainty he had left with, his hands now empty, but his posture unchanged. And when his mother reached for him, her touch softer than it had been before, He did not pull away, but he did not speak either, because there were no words that could hold what he had just carried out and brought back. Above them, the ridges stood bare again. The shapes of the land returned to what they had always been, and yet no one looked at them the same way. Because once you have seen something stand there, in silence, you do not forget the possibility of it returning. The day moved forward, the sun climbing higher, the heat settling in, but the town did not shake off the morning as easily as it had other days. There was a pause in everything, a space between actions where thought had begun to take root, and in that space, something new had started to form, something that could not be forced, only allowed. Ethan rode on, the distance growing, the town becoming smaller until it was nothing more than a shape against the horizon. And still he did not hurry, because there was no need. Whatever had been set in motion did not depend on his presence to continue. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of the open land, clean and dry, and he reached down, touching the canteen once more, not to drink, but to feel its presence, to remind himself that what mattered had already been decided without a single word spoken. Far behind him, in a town that had learned something it could not unlearn, life would go on, but not quite the same, not quite as easy, and that was enough, because out here, change did not arrive with noise or force, it arrived quietly, settled, and slowly, and stayed long after the moment that brought it had passed. Ethan adjusted his hat against the sun, his eyes forward, his path clear, and as the land opened up around him, vast and unbroken, he carried nothing more than what he needed, a horse beneath him, a canteen at his side, and the understanding that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is walk away and let silence do the rest. The land opened wider as the miles passed beneath Ethan Cole's horse, the horizon stretching out in long quiet lines that did not ask where he had come from or where he was headed, only that he keep moving with the same steady rhythm that had carried him this far, and for a while that was enough. The sound of hooves against dry ground, the creak of leather, the wind slipping past his shoulders like something familiar and unspoken. The sun climbed higher, settling into that hard noon light that flattened shadows and left everything exposed. And still he rode on without pause, not because he was in a hurry, but because there was nothing behind him that needed returning to, and nothing ahead that required anything more than patience. The canteen at his side rested heavier now, not from the water it held, but from the meaning it carried, and when his hand brushed against it, he did not lift it, did not drink. He simply let his fingers rest there for a moment, as if confirming that what had happened had not been imagined, that it had taken shape in the world and would remain there long after he was gone. Somewhere in the distance, the land dipped into a shallow valley where a line of cottonwood trees broke the monotony of dry grass and stone, their leaves shifting softly in the breeze, and Ethan guided his horse toward them without thinking, drawn by the promise of shade more than anything else. When he reached the edge of that small grove, he slowed, letting the horse lower its head and drink from a narrow stream that cut quietly through the earth, the water moving without sound, without urgency, as if it had all the time it needed. Ethan dismounted, stepping into the shade where the air felt cooler, where the sun did not press so hard against his back, and for a moment, he stood there, still, listening not to anything in particular, but to the absence of noise, to the way the world settled when it was left alone. He reached for the canteen then, unhooking it from his side, and this time he lifted it, taking a measured drink, not because he needed it, but because he could, and there was something in that simple act that felt different now, something that carried more weight than thirst alone. He lowered it slowly, turning it in his hand, the dented metal, catching the light in small, uneven reflections, each mark a quiet reminder of where it had been and what it had held before. Behind him, far beyond the reach of that quiet grove, the town had begun to find its way back in motion, but not without pause, not without thought. And Sheriff Harold Pike stood at the edge of the street once more, his gaze no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but settled, as if something in him had finally come to rest in a place he had not known was empty. Before, he moved slowly through the town, not as a man enforcing rules, but as someone observing, taking in the small changes that had begun to show themselves, the way voices lowered before rising, the way people looked at one another a second longer than they used to, as if trying to see something beyond the surface. The boy sat on the steps outside his home, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, his hands resting in his lap where the canteen had been earlier, and though he said nothing, there was a steadiness in him now, a quiet understanding that had taken root without needing explanation. The man from the porch had not returned to his usual place. He remained seated where he had been, his gaze drifting out over the street, not with regret, not with denial, but with something closer to acceptance, as if he had begun to understand that what had changed could not be undone, only carried forward. Back beneath the cottonwood trees, Ethan secured the canteen once more at his side, his movements unhurried, deliberate, and when he mounted his horse again, he did not look back, not because he had forgotten, but because he knew that what mattered had already been left where it needed to be. The wind moved through the leaves above him, soft and steady, and as he rode out from the shade and back into the open land, the world felt wider, not because it had changed, but because something within it had shifted, something that did not belong to any one place or person, but to the quiet understanding that sometimes the smallest act can travel farther than any man ever could. And out here, where words carried little weight, it was the things left unsaid that lasted the longest. By late afternoon the land had softened again, the sharp edge of noon giving way to longer shadows that stretched across the ground like quiet reminders that everything moved whether a man noticed or not. And Ethan Cole rode through that shifting light without changing his pace, the rhythm of his horse steady, unbroken, carrying him deeper into a stretch of country that felt untouched by the small weight of towns and their decisions. The canteen rested against his side, no longer just an object, but something that had taken on a presence of its own, and every so often his hand would drift toward it without thought, not to drink, not to check, but to feel it there, to confirm that what had passed between him and that town had not faded into something less than it had been. The wind moved across the open land with a low, constant voice, bending the grass in slow waves, and Ethan watched it for a moment, the way it carried no judgment, no memory, only movement, and there was something in that simplicity that felt honest in a way people rarely managed. Behind him, though far enough now that the town could no longer be seen, its presence remained, not as a place, but as a quiet echo, something that had settled into the space between thoughts, showing itself in small ways, in the way he noticed the sky, in the way he measured distance, in the way he chose not to hurry. Back in that town, the day had continued to unfold, but not in the same careless rhythm it once had. Sheriff Harold Pike had walked the length of the street more than once, his steps slow, deliberate, his eyes taking in details he might have ignored before, the worn boards of the porch, the scuffed marks in the dust, the place where the canteen had rested. And though nothing there had changed in a way that could be pointed to, everything felt different in a way that could not be denied. He paused near the well, his hand resting on the wood, the bucket hanging still beside him, and for a long moment he simply stood there, looking at the water below as if it held an answer that had always been present but never considered. The man who had poured the water the day before approached quietly, his steps measured, his posture no longer carrying the easy confidence that had once defined him. And when he stopped beside the sheriff, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the words would have made it smaller than it was. The boy remained near the edge of the street, watching them both, his eyes steady, his presence unchanged, and there was something in that stillness that made the adults around him aware of themselves in ways they had not expected. The wind passed through the town again, softer, now, carrying the scent of dry earth and something else beneath it, something like possibility, and the sheriff reached for the bucket, lifting it slowly, the rope creaking as it moved, the sound familiar but carrying a different weight. He did not rush, did not act for show. He simply filled the bucket and set it down where it could be reached, not hidden, not guarded, just there, and though no one commented, though no one acknowledged it aloud, the gesture settled into the space around them, quiet and certain, like a stone placed where it would remain. Far out on the open land, Ethan slowed his horse as the light began to fade, the sky turning in soft gradients of gold and gray, and he guided the animal toward a small rise where he could see the horizon clearly, not because he expected anything, but because he understood the value of seeing as far as he could before night took the land. He dismounted, standing beside his horse, his hand resting lightly against its neck, and for a moment he looked out across the distance, the same distance that now held a town learning how to carry what it had been shown. He did not think about returning, did not consider whether anything there would change beyond what had already begun. Because that was not his to decide, not his to follow. Instead, he lifted the canteen once more, taking a slow drink, the water cool against his throat, and when he lowered it, he held it in his hand for a moment longer, turning it slightly as the last light caught its surface. The evening settled in around him, quiet and steady, and as the first hint of night touched the edges of the land, Ethan secured the canteen at his side once more, his movements calm, unhurried, and mounted his horse. Again, turning toward the path ahead without hesitation, because some stories did not need to be carried forward, they needed to be left where they could grow on their own. And as he rode on into the fading light, the land stretched out before him, unchanged and endless, holding its silence the same way it always had. But now, somewhere within that silence, something new had taken root, something that would remain long after the dust had settled and the moment itself had passed. The night settled gently over the land, not with darkness alone, but with a kind of quiet that felt earned, as if the day had carried something heavy and now finally set it down, and Ethan Cole rode beneath that sky without urgency, the stars beginning to show themselves one by one, distant and steady, offering no answers and asking none in return. The air had cooled, the wind softer now, carrying the faint scent of earth that had released the heat it held all day, and with each breath, the world felt wider, less burdened, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to let it breathe again. Ethan slowed his horse near a low ridge, not because he needed rest, but because the land itself seemed to ask for stillness, and he listened, the way a man learns to listen when there is nothing left to prove, only something left to understand. He dismounted, his boots pressing into the ground with a quiet firmness, and stood there for a moment, looking out across the open stretch where the horizon met the sky, the same horizon that now held a town behind him and a future ahead of him, both equally distant, both equally real. His hand moved to the canteen again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, and he unhooked it, holding it in the dim light, turning it slightly as if the marks on its surface might tell him something new. The dents, the scratches, the small imperfections that once meant nothing now carried weight, not because they had changed, but because he had, and he understood that some objects do not gain value from what they are, but from what they witness. He did not drink, not yet. He simply held it there, letting the moment settle into him, letting the silence stretch without needing to fill it. Far behind him, in that town that had stood so certain of itself just a day before, the night had come differently, not louder, not quieter, but deeper, as if every shadow held more than it used to, as if every door closed with a little more thought than before. Sheriff Harold Pike sat outside the small office that had once defined his role, his hat resting low, his hands folded loosely in his lap, not watching the street, but remembering it, replaying the moment that had changed it, not as a failure, but as something unfinished that had found its ending without him. The well stood nearby, the bucket resting where he had left it, filled and waiting, not as a gesture, but as a quiet truth that would remain whether anyone reached for it or not. The man from the porch had gone home early, his usual place left empty, and though no one spoke of it, the absence said enough. Because some habits do not return once they have been broken in the right way, the boy lay awake longer than he should have, staring at the ceiling, his mind holding on to the image of the canteen in his hands, the weight of it, the way it had felt to carry something that mattered, and though he did not understand all of it, he understood enough to know that something in him had changed, something that would not return to what it was before. The town slept eventually, but not as easily, not as carelessly, and in that restless quiet, something had begun to grow, something that would not show itself in a single day, but would remain, shaping small choices, small moments, the kind that build into something larger over time. Back on the ridge, Ethan finally lifted the canteen, taking a slow drink, the water cool and steady, not rushed, not needed in desperation, but chosen, and when he lowered it, he closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, as if marking the end of something that had carried him this far. He secured it again at his side, his hand resting there for a second longer, then stepped back toward his horse, his movements calm, unforced, and mounted without hesitation. The night stretched out ahead of him, open and unclaimed, and as he turned his horse toward it, he did not look back, not because he had nothing left behind, but because what he had left was no longer his to carry. The land accepted him the way it always had, without judgment, without memory, only with the quiet understanding that a man moves forward not by forgetting, but by knowing when to let something remain where it belongs. And as Ethan rode on beneath the wide, endless sky, the silence followed him not as an absence, but as a presence, steady and certain, the kind that does not need to speak to be heard. The first light of morning came quietly again, but this time it carried no weight, no question, only a calm that stretched across the land like something that had finally found its place. And Ethan Cole rode into it without looking for anything more than what the road would give him. His posture steady, his hands relaxed on the reins, the kind of stillness that does not come from emptiness, but from knowing there is nothing left to resolve. The sky opened wide above him, pale blue growing stronger with each passing minute, and the horizon no longer felt distant. It felt reachable in a way that did not require effort, only time, and Ethan understood that was enough. The canteen rested against his side, no longer a reminder, no longer a question, but something settled, something that had already said what it needed to say, and when his hand brushed against it, there was no hesitation, no thought, only the quiet acknowledgement of its presence. Behind him, far beyond the reach of sound or sight, the town had begun a new day, but not as it had before, not with the same careless rhythm, not with the same easy certainty, because something had changed there in a way that could not be undone, not by time, not by habit, not by silence. Sheriff Harold Pike stepped out into the street once more, his boots steady against the ground, his gaze clear, and though nothing in his title had changed, something in the way he carried it had, as if he had finally understood that law was not just something enforced, but something lived, something chosen in the smallest of moments. The bucket remained by the well, filled as it had been left, not as a symbol, not as a display, but as a quiet offering that did not need to be announced, and people passed by it differently now, some pausing for a second longer, some reaching for it without looking around, as if the act itself no longer required permission. The man from the porch returned to the street, but he did not take his old place. He stood instead at the edge of it, his hands at his sides, his posture less certain, but more honest, and when someone approached him, he did not speak loudly, did not laugh, he simply nodded, his voice lower. His presence changed in a way that did not need explanation. The boy moved through the town with the same quiet steadiness, his eyes noticing more than they had before, his steps measured, as if he had learned that even the smallest movement could carry meaning. And when he passed the well, he stopped briefly, his hand resting on the edge, not to take, not to give, but to remember. Life resumed, but it did not erase what had happened. It carried it forward, weaving it into the rhythm of the town in ways that could not be separated from what came next. And though no one spoke of that morning in detail, no one needed to, because it lived in the way they looked at one another, in the way they chose, in the way they paused before acting. Far out on the open land, Ethan rode on, the distance growing, the town becoming something that existed only in memory, and even that memory did not press against him. It rested, like the canteen at his side, something carried without weight. He guided his horse along a rising path, the ground lifting gently beneath them, and when he reached the crest, he paused, not because he needed to, but because the view offered itself, the land, stretching out in every direction, open and unclaimed, the kind of space that did not hold on to what passed through it, only allowed it to move on. He sat there for a moment, the wind moving softly around him, the world quiet in that way it only becomes when nothing is being forced, and then he nudged his horse forward again, not toward anything in particular, but into the space that lay ahead, because that was where he belonged. The sun climbed higher, the light steady, the shadows fading, and as he rode, there was no need for words, no need for reflection, because everything that had needed to be understood had already found its place. Back in that small town, Beneath a sky that looked the same as it always had, people moved a little slower, listened a little longer, and somewhere in the quiet space between what had been and what would be, something remained, not as a lesson spoken aloud, but as a truth felt deeply, that out here, where the land does not judge and the wind does not. Remember, justice does not come with noise or force. It comes quietly, carried in the choices people make when no one is telling them what to do, and it stays long after the moment that brought it has passed.